Well, about 25 years ago, the before I began seminary, I got a job at this wonderful little boarding school, Presbyterian school called Wasatch Academy. Now, Wasatch Academy is 2 hours south of Salt Lake City, and it is in very rural Utah. And it's a wonderful place. And by the way, if you are looking for a school to help your kids just figure out life, I cannot say enough about Wasatch Academy. Now, there isn't a whole lot in Wasatch, though, other than the academy and not any restaurants and not any other establishments. But there is one thing that they have an abundance of, and that is sheep. It is actually considered the old sheep capital of the Intermountain West. There were sheep everywhere throughout Mount Pleasant, Utah. People, instead of having dogs and cats, yes, they would have sheep. So I got to learn and know a little bit about the qualities and the nature of sheep that year. And one of the people who taught me about sheep was an amazing guy who did maintenance at Wasatch Academy, who was a part-time maintenance worker, part-time cowboy, by the name of Jim Berlin. They used to say that Jim was as big as his name, and he was 6'7". He had a huge red beard, and he was tough as steel. But I went over to Jim Berlin's house one day, and when I say house, I mean that in a broad sense of the word. It felt a little bit more like a junkyard, but I remember going over to Jim's house, and there I saw his flock of sheep. And I said to Jim, that's an amazing, beautiful flock of sheep, but I noticed that you don't have a pen around them or a fence of any kind. There's nothing holding the sheep in. And I said, Jim, aren't you worried that your sheep are going to run away? And I'll never forget, Jim looked at me, and then he looked at the ground, and then he spat on the ground, and then he looked off into the horizon, and then he looked down on the ground again, and he spat on the ground again, and he looked me in the eye, and he said, son, sheep don't run, sheep wander. And I never forgot that lesson about sheep from Jim Berlin. Sheep wander. Jim later explained to me that sheep don't run. They just nibble a little grass here, and then a little more grass here, and a little more grass here, and a little more grass here. And before you know it, they're out of the frame. They nibble a little grass here, and they nibble a little grass here. He explained that he could come back at the end of the day, and he would just go about 100 yards away because the sheep had just wandered 100 yards and bring him back. The only problem would be if you came back in 2 weeks, they'd be miles away. But he said sheep wander. And I said, well, Jim, can't you train the sheep not to wander? Can't you just tell them not to do it? He said, Graham, and he spat on the ground, you can't train a sheep to do anything. It's in their nature. Sheep just wander. I said, well, that's amazing, Jim. I love that wisdom you just gave me. And is there any other wisdom you want to tell me today? And he looked me in the eye and he said, yep. And he said, don't call me Jim. And I'll never forget. God bless Jim Berlin. But as I've been thinking about that for about 25 years now, I've been thinking that the primary metaphor that God uses for us human beings is that we are sheep. You find this literally from the beginning of the Bible to the end of the Bible. We are continually compared to being sheep. And again, we could explore the question of why God didn't call us some other animal like a naked mole rat or a zebra or an elephant, but no, God calls us sheep. And I think I have figured out why God calls us sheep. Because God knows that we said last week, we are all beautiful birds. We are all beautiful people. We are all made in God's image. And B, we all wander like sheep. We don't run, we just wander. And if we were to explore the history of wandering, and by the way, I'm going to use the word wander today instead of sin or corruption or depravity or evil or any of those words, because I think wandering is closer to what we do. But if we were to explore all the wandering in the Bible that begins in the Garden of Eden, it's all wandering. Think of the very first sin in history. We are told that in the Garden of Eden, Genesis 1, Genesis 2, God creates all things. Then God creates humans on the sixth day. And then they live in paradise for 2 chapters. And then the wandering begins in chapter 3. And it begins this way. The snake comes to Eve and says, Eve, and he puts doubt, the first D word. Did God really tell you to do that? Then Eve began to wander. And then the second D, and then the snake says to Eve, I got to tell you something, God is lying to you. And then there's a little more wandering. And before you know it, the third D, destruction, the snake convinces Adam and Eve that you can be better than God. God's just trying to keep you down. That's the first wandering in the history of the faith. But ever since then, people have wandered and wandered and wandered and wandered. So I want to talk about that today. I want you to think about how you wander. I'll talk about how I wander here in a moment. But let's take a look at our text. It's just one sentence today, and I'm sure you've heard it, especially if you attend the classic service, because it's usually given right before the confession. But it's Isaiah 53:6. This is what Isaiah says. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. To use the word of the day, we have all wandered. Each of us has turned to our own way. Now let's lift up a couple of biblical pieces here. The word that Isaiah uses again and again and again for sin, and again we're using the word wander, is the word avon. This is the Hebrew word avon. And by the way, isn't Hebrew language beautiful? But avon does not mean to run away. Actually, look at this middle letter here. This is what avon means. It's the walking stick that's bent. It's the walking stick that has just wandered a little bit. And Paul would pick up on this in the New Testament when he talks about sin. He doesn't use some word like total evil. He uses the word hamartano, which is where we get the word for archers who are trying to hit the mark and they're just a little bit off. It's when the arrow just wanders. So today, again, I want you to think about how you wander, but I want to share with you 3 biggies that most of us will find ourselves in the category of. The first wandering that many people, especially in the Bay Area, suffer from is the wandering of perfectionism. So I've been working on the perfect illustration this week to help illustrate this point. I started on Monday and I thought, I could talk about the school systems, but that didn't seem right. Then on Tuesday, I thought, well, maybe I'll talk about Tiger Woods, but that just felt out of place. And then Wednesday, I thought, well, maybe I'll talk about the stuff happening in Washington. And by Thursday, when I wrote my sermon, I still hadn't come up with the perfect illustration for the sin or wandering of perfectionism. And then I realized I kind of am the perfect illustration for the sin of perfectionism. I suffer from this sin. Now, I hasten to add, not in all of my life, as my poor wife will tell you. I am not a perfectionist as a parent. I am not a perfectionist as a husband. But I am a perfectionist in speaking and preaching. And the thing that I have learned about in my life is that it is preventing me from being who God wants me to be, and it is preventing God from entering into my speaking and preaching as much as I would like God to do. But I'm guessing I'm not the only one who suffers from perfectionism, because you would not be living here in the Bay Area or have gone to the college you went to or have gotten the corner office that you did if you also didn't have the sin of perfectionism. And how does it all begin? It begins with wandering. It begins in preschool when you get that first A on finger painting and you're so proud of yourself and you realize that it's a way that you can kind of begin to control the world. And then the next year you get your second A in ABCs. And then the third year you get your third A in 1, 2, 3s. And before you know it, you are trying to control the world around you by being perfect in everything. The problem with being a perfectionist, though, is there's only one perfect person who has ever lived. and that is Jesus Christ. And when we say, well, I'm going to be perfect, what we're really saying is that we don't really need God. And by the way, I have a theory about why people in the Bay Area especially are struggling more than many other parts of the country in this COVID crisis. And that is because of this sin or wandering of perfectionism, because we can't control the stuff that's going on around us. So number one, it's the wandering of perfectionism. And if you do wander in perfectionism, just give yourself the permission to get a C this week in something. The second wandering I want to talk about today is the wandering of defeatism. Now, this may not seem like a wandering, because we usually think of wandering or sin as like ego, like I think I'm better than everybody else. But thinking less of yourself is actually just as bad as thinking too much of yourself. It's the wandering that goes, I can't do this, I'm no good, I don't have an answer, I can't do anything, I'm a failure, I have no future, there's no way out of this. There was an amazing article this last week in the New York Times that I encourage you to Google if you're interested in this topic. And it is written by senior op-ed writer Jennifer Denure. And she titles the article, Why Do So Many Mothers Feel Like Failures Right Now? And it's a fascinating piece, and she's also written a book on this, but she, cites the big reasons why often moms feel inadequate. They have often been laid off or lost their work, disproportionate to other people in our work communities. They often find themselves doing more of the burdens of family life, which disproportionately fall on them. We live in a country that is uniquely bad in the civilized world for not providing support mechanisms for moms to take maternity leaves and other support mechanisms, so moms are flying solo. But then she has this amazing sentence, and she says this, can the reason that moms feel like a failure be explained simply by the mom propensity towards casual self-recrimination? She said, maybe, partly, but also, she says, I have a modest hypothesis. What this pandemic has done, not to all of us, she said, moms, but to many, is to make us feel more insecure about our aspects of our parenting we were already very insecure about. In other words, so many moms in this country are suffering from the wandering of defeatism. And I just want to tell you from the bottom of mine and God's heart, today, if you are a mom watching, you are doing an amazing job. You get an AAA triple plus. You get to take next semester off. Way to go. But the third wandering I want to share with might be the most complicated to understand, but it is central to the Christian faith. And it is the wandering of, hey, the path's just right there. It's the wandering of being close to the path, but not on the path. And this is central to the Christian faith. And this is why it's so hard for some people to really kind of wrap their minds around Christianity, because we assume that if we're doing pretty well, then we're doing good enough. But being close to the path in the Christian faith is sometimes as being bad as being 100 miles from the path. C.S. Lewis tried to put his finger on this in one of his very good books. And if you're more intellectually oriented, I encourage you to read this, The God in the Dock by Clive Staples Lewis. But in it, he says this, whenever he would get into an audience and speak to them, he said, the greatest barrier that I have is the almost total absence from the minds of my audience of any sense of sin or wandering. He said the early Christian preachers could assume that their hearers, whether pagans or atheists, had just this sense of guilt. Thus, the Christian message, says Lewis, was in those days unmistakably the evangelism, the good news. It promised healing to those who knew they were sick. We, he said, have to convince our hearers of the unwelcome diagnosis before we can expect them to welcome the good news of the remedy. Now keep in mind that Lewis was writing this in the 40s and in the 50s. Where are we now in the year 2021? What is the diagnosis that Lewis is talking about? All people wander. Sometimes those things that are just close to the path are scarier than the things that are a long way away. I heard this amazing story, true story this last week about the 1960s and the Mossad, or the Israeli intelligence service, were going about the globe trying to round up all of the perpetrators of the horrible, atrocious war crimes that happened in World War II against Jewish people, the millions and millions of Jews who were sent to death camps. And so they went around the world looking for people who had done these terrible, horrible, evil things. And they found one of them nestled in this fortress in a far back region of South America, and his name was Adolf Eichmann. So they arrested Eichmann there and they flew him to Israel, where they were undergoing these war crimes tribunals. And they managed to tell these witnesses or people who had been in these camps that if they had just had the courage to come in and stand up against these terrible people, that they could bring justice. So one of these amazing people was a man by the name of Yahil Denure. And this is him, and he escaped Auschwitz back in the day. As Yahil Denure would come into the courtroom, he would see Adolf Eichmann, who had killed many of his family members not too long ago, there sitting in the dock. And there Yahil Denure began to cry profusely, fall apart, even fall onto the floor when he looked into the eyes of Adolf Eichmann. And Yahil Denure would later say that when he was on 60 Minutes, when he would discuss this with Mike Wallace, he said, "My problem was that Eichmann was not the demonic personification of evil I had expected. Rather, he was an ordinary man and looked like just anybody else." And he said, "In that one instant, I came to the stunning realization that sin and evil and wandering are the human condition. All people wander." And he said, "I was afraid about myself. I saw that I am capable to do this exactly like he." See, Eichmann realizes that being close to the path is just as bad as being a million miles. But I've always wondered, what if we had interviewed Adolf Eichmann after those trials? I wonder if Eichmann could have told us how he got to the death camps. I wonder if he might have said, "Well, I just started down a little nibble path of anti-Semitism, and then I began to think evil and hatred thoughts, and before I knew it, I found myself far, far away." This is kind of a heavy topic, and so I want to offer just something a little bit lighter. And so I want to offer a joke, but I want you to realize that this joke is not funny. In fact, I picked a joke that was so unfunny that I want to make sure that you do not laugh at this joke, but I'm working on my Wandering of Perfectionism, so I'm just giving a C, that's actually maybe a D joke at this point, and so I'm just warning you right now, but it speaks to the tendency in our lives to wander in the same ways again and again and again. So there's these hunters up in Alaska, and they find this the deer, and they were able to get this deer, and then they get back to their biplane where they're hoping to kind of get out of the Alaska outback, and so they get the deer right there, and the pilot says, "We are not going to get out of this place if you get that deer on and all your gear." And the guys say, "Well, yes, we will." And the pilot says, "No, we won't." And the guy said, "Yes, we will." So they put the deer and all of their gear onto that little biplane, and they started that plane, and the propeller starts to flap around a little bit, and it starts to skim across the frozen lake, and then it goes right above the trees, and then it falls right into the snow on the other side, and none of them are hurt. But the deer hunters look at the pilot, and they say, "Where are we?" And the pilot says, "We are 50 feet further than we were last year." I told you it was bad. But that did help me to give a really bad joke that is not perfect. I want to end with some hope. Jesus would tell a story about a shepherd who would go after the sheep. And he would say this is Luke 15, 3-7. "Suppose one of you has 100 sheep and loses one of them. one of those sheep wanders off, doesn't he leave the 99 sheep in the open country and go after the lost sheep until he finds it? And when he finds it, he joyfully picks it up and he puts it on his shoulders and he goes home. And then he calls his friends and his neighbors together and says, "Rejoice with me, I have found my lost sheep." And I tell you that there is more rejoicing in heaven over the one wandering sheep who asks to be found than over the whole 99 who did not ask to be found and brought back. My friends, we are that sheep. We are that wandering sheep. And so I just have one question to ask you. Do you want to be found?